I think you can see where the master cylinder goes in and that pin sticks out, and this is a clip that attaches to that pin, and once that pin, this clip is removed, that pin should be able to push through and come out the other side. It should slide out. I've been working 10 hours to get that pin out. Easy, 10 hours, easy. And I tried different ways to do it. I thought I could get a C-clamp on it. That's too small. I had to get a deep well C-clamp, and it turns out I didn't have enough room to put the deep well C-clamp on and still be able to turn it. I ended up using, because there was a little nipple of that sticking out here, I was able to use a slide hammer. Let's see if I can get this loose here. This is a slide hammer. All right, you can see that rod in the inside. All right, and I was able to put the slide hammer, the tube of it up against that, the little bit that was sticking out, and then it's tough to show you this holding it, but this slide hammer goes in and it's a lot of weight and it pushes against that, and it's the only thing that broke it free. After 10 hours of hammering and fooling around and playing games with it and getting the channel lock pliers onto it. There they are, channel lock pliers on the end of it, and twisting it and moving it. Finally, I used the slide hammer on it. First shot, popped it right out. So you just got to get something heavy on it. After that, I'll take out the master cylinder. There were two bolts that held that in place, and that held the cylinder in place up here. And then this bolt here, this clevis pin, is the one that holds the push rod of the clutch in place. And then you have to take off the work light is your best friend and worst enemy. And then you have to remove the line for the right in here. This is the brake fluid reservoir line, which brake fluid reservoir is used also from your it's used from your brake cylinder. It doesn't have a master cylinder clutch master cylinder reservoir. It uses the reservoir of your brakes. And then you have to remove it from the bottom down here, down in here, and this pulls out, and there's a clip that you have to unhook to release this tube from. This goes down to the slave cylinder. So that's it. So we'll see what happens. Today is May 25th, 2016. I'm replacing the master clutch cylinder on a 1.9 liter 1996 Z3. The fluid that's used for the clutch, the hydraulic fluid, comes from the brake cylinder, the master brake cylinder reservoir. And this reservoir has a line that goes to the end of it, and it attaches here. And I had it disconnected, but since I can't see where it goes through the firewall, I've tied a hose on, a string on to the end of the hose so that I can pull the hose back up, because I had to pull it back through the firewall, and I'll show you why in a second. But I have a string attached so that when I'm done and I feed the excess hose that I pulled through the firewall, when I feed it back, I'll be able to pull it back up without having to dig for it. the clutch had failed on the car, and because I could not get the car in and out of gear before the clutch failed, there was no problem with the car driving in gear, as it didn't slip, and I did not feel there was any slippage that the clutch disc had worn, so that I would have to replace the clutch mechanism itself. What the problem was, I couldn't shift it in and out of gear, and I had to turn the engine off before I could get it in and out of gear. This is the clutch master cylinder, and these two bolt holes is where the clutch attaches to the frame of the car, up underneath the clutch pedal. The end of this here is where it attaches to the clutch pedal itself by means of a pin that goes through here and through the pedal, and a clevis pin, and then the clevis pin has a clevis pin clip that pulls that pin in place. This end section, which I almost had to destroy to get off, is the part that attaches to the hose that goes down to the slave cylinder that is attached to the bell housing of the manual transmission. And there is a clip that goes on right here that holds this in place, and when I tried to remove the clip, it wouldn't budge. Of course, it's been there for 20 years, I guess. So as a result, I had to get a Dremel and cut the clip in several places before I could remove this from the coupling that leads down to the slave cylinder. The fluid that goes into the clutch from the master brake cylinder runs through the line I just showed you on the engine compartment side of the firewall. That line, it's a braided rubber hose line that goes down through the firewall, and this particular section right here has a rubber grommet that fits in it, and the rubber grommet has a hole, and in that hole fits a tube that sticks out. The tube is about, I guess, a little over an inch and a half long, with a 30-degree bend in it about halfway, and that tube goes through the center of the grommet, which fits in here very tightly, and that the other end of the tube that comes out of this grommet fits into the tube that comes down from the engine compartment and through the firewall to supply hydraulic fluid for the clutch from the master brake cylinder. It is not a pressure line, it's gravity feed. So the tube that comes out of the center of this grommet is just plugged into the rubber hose that comes through the firewall underneath where the pedals are, and it's just a tight fit. It doesn't drip because one, there's no pressure to it, and it is a very tight fit. However, when I removed this and I tried to pull this down and out, instead of the grommet coming out with the tube, the grommet stayed in here, the tube stayed in here, and the other end of the tube pulled free from the supply tube that comes down from the brake master cylinder. I'll show you that in a second. Exceptionally, and I mean exceptionally, difficult working on this because it's up underneath the dashboard, and I showed you that this has two bolts, the two bolt holes that the bolts go through and attach to the car. These are the bolts. All right. The nut goes. These two bolts is a short one and a long one. The short one goes through the hole that's closest to the firewall. The longer one goes to the hole that's closest to the passenger seat. When the long one goes through both the master cylinder and the bracket on the car that holds the master cylinder in place, there is also a bracket that has a bolt on it that has buttons that aid. One is a brake pedal button and the other one is a clutch button. I imagine the brake pedal button, when you push the brake pedal, it allows the brake light to go on. And I think the clutch pedal button may be a safety button that tells the car that the clutch is depressed and you can start the car. This is the bracket that has a bolt on the end of it that has these two buttons, all right, which are the buttons that one is for the brake and one is for the clutch. This bracket, let's see if I can get the light right. This bracket, hold on. This bracket attaches up over here. I don't know if you can see that. There's two holes there where the bracket goes through. Let's see if we can get a look at that. That's the bracket. There's one hole up top here. One hole up top here. And the second hole has a depression in it that a nut fits into for the shorter screw that's closest to the firewall. The nut that attaches to this is the nut that is welded to this plate right here that holds the buttons for the pedals. Let's see if we can move this a bit. All right, this is the hose. This is the hose that comes down from the brake master cylinder reservoir through the firewall there. I don't know if you can see that, through the firewall, and goes on to the this grommet. I told you there was a grommet in the you see the let's see if I can get a good picture of this. You see where that hole is right there. That's where the grommet goes, and the tube that comes out of that is the tube that's in the center of this hose right now. In order to hook that up, because it's very difficult to get both hands under there, you either get one or the other, or you work blind with one hand. The tube, the grommet goes in over here, in here, all right, and the hose is the tube comes out, and I've just stuck it onto this hose. Now it occurred to me that if from working this tube in and out of this hose, that it may have weakened it and it might leak, even though it's only gravity fed. I've gotten a hose clamp right here that I'm going to put onto that hose. I could take the hose off and put the clamp on and reattach the hose, but I just don't want to take the chance of damaging that hose or weakening it by taking it on and off again. So I unscrewed the clamp and opened it up, and I'll put the clamp around, and then I'll tighten the clamp onto the end of that, onto the end of this hose here. And that will be that might take me an hour to do, just because it will be extremely difficult to get a tool onto the end of this, probably a socket on the end of this, and with one hand, with probably a very long extension, try to turn this, all right, and the other hand trying to close this around the hose so that it meets and starts to thread. So that's going to be fun. That's probably like 2 hours work just to have fun, only because you just can't get to it when you're kneeling next to the car and you're sticking your head in underneath the pedals. Also, before I start to work on putting that clamp on there, this is the ring that fits into the clutch pedal here, the back of the clutch pedal, and there's a pin that goes through here, goes through the clutch pedal, goes through here, and then goes through the other side of the clutch pedal, and a clip that holds it on. Also on the brake pedal here, I had to remove, right about in here, I had to remove a clip that holds on the, you see on this pedal here, there's a stop right here, right here, that hits the, right here, that hits the button on this bracket here, one of these buttons. But the same pad over here I had to remove, and it's only a pin that holds it on in order to get my hands in there and get a tool to work while trying to put this up. Okay, I managed to get this clip on here. See if I can see that properly. There, you can see the clamp that's on the hose. I forgot to tell you that I already attached the lower end of this, of the master cylinder onto the coupling down here that goes through the firewall. And when I get this back up into place, that's right over here, when I get this back up into place, I will push this rubber seal back into place, and you'll be able to see the lower coupling. That lower coupling there goes down to the, see if I get my hands on it, that goes down to the, that's the connection for the slave cylinder. I got the pin in place over here. Let's see if I can, okay, right here, that's the pin that holds the, that's the clevis pin that holds, the clevis pin clip that holds this, plate on. This plate is the stop plate for the electrical switch that's now going to go up here, and we're going to try to get that switch up in here now. And I'll show you how to do that in a minute. I managed to get this bracket back up in place here. There's the bolt with the nut threaded through it. Took me about 40 tries, maybe 50, but I was able to get it, and it wasn't easy. Now the pedal, that works, it's on a spring. And the spring on this one's attached. This was really difficult to get that spring up. Had to take that bracket off just to get the spring up. And it seems to be all in place now. All I have to do now is to reattach on the other side of this. There's a supply hose that comes down from the goes into the top of that. It's a supply hose that I showed you earlier, and I have to reattach that on the firewall side of the engine. And it's about to rain, and it's 6:39 in the evening, and I'm going to call it quits. It's too difficult to get both hands in this at the same time. What I'm doing is I have a long pair of pliers, and I'm holding this up against that screw that's sticking out. I'm going to hold it up against there, and with the hand that I'm now holding the camera, I'm going to put the camera down and get a socket in. Get a ratchet, a 1/4-inch drive ratchet in with a 10mm socket on it, and try to start turning the bolt from the other side of this bracket and see if I can start threading it onto this nut. And as you see, there's two switches here, and both these switches, I don't know if I can show you, both these switches are for, one's for the clutch and one's for the brake. And with the pedals in place, they will be spring loaded against that. So to try to hold this against the nut, against the spring load, and try to turn it, and maybe it'll take me 50, 60 tries, I don't know. Today is June 4th. I'm trying to run the other way. I finished making all the connections underneath where the master clutch is. I had to put, this is the brake cylinder, master brake cylinder, or master brake reservoir, and the hydraulic fluid that is used in here is also used via this hose here to the master clutch cylinder. So they both use the same reservoir. I had to pull, this hose goes down and through the firewall, but in order to connect it to the clutch master cylinder, I had to disconnect this and pull the hose back through the firewall onto the other side, to the engine side, to the passenger side, so I had enough room to enough hose to work with to get it onto the master cylinder, the clutch master cylinder. Now that it's attached, I had pushed the excess hose back through the firewall, and in order that this hose wasn't lost, because you can hardly reach down in here to get it, I tied this string to it, and tied the string off over here. So all I had to do was pull on the string to pull back up from the bottom of this compartment, pull this hose back up so I could connect it to the brake cylinder again. And what I will do is bleed the system in reverse. I will bleed it, pushing fluid from the slave cylinder through the bleed screw of the slave cylinder back up into the master cylinder, which will then feed back up into here, and that will push all the air bubbles upwards, which is the normal way they would want to go, instead of trying to bleed it the reverse way. So that's what I'm going to do, and that's it for right now. Let's see if I can get a picture of this. This is, let's see if you can see this. This is the rubber here where the bottom of this master cylinder, clutch master cylinder, goes into the firewall. Let's see if I get, goes into the firewall here, and here's a piece of rubber that goes around it. And it's been pulled through when I pulled the connection through, so I have to reinsert half of this rubber into the firewall so it seals, so water won't get in, or air. I am going to bench bleed this much the way you would bench bleed a brake master cylinder, and that is I'll pour some fluid in here, and I'll push in the push rod, and it will then you'll see bubbles coming up out of here. Now I got to be able to do that. I'm going to turn this off for just a second. It's difficult to do with one hand, but I'm going to push the push rod, as you see here. I'm going to push it in, and the fluid that I just poured into the top of this is going to, it'll bubble up. Now watch the bubbles come out. See the bubbles coming out? All right, and the fluid will then go in. This will help when you want to bleed this. It'll make it a lot shorter bleeding it when it's inside the car. When you bleed it like this outside the car. Let's see if I can hold the camera, and we'll just give it a little fluid. All right, and let's see if you can see the bubbles coming up. I don't know if you can see the bubbles. I think you can. And we'll keep doing that until fluid starts coming up instead of the bubbles. I've bench bled this to the point that if I push this piston in at all, fluid will start to come out of here instead of bubbles. See it? See the fluid? So you know this thing is full of fluid. Maybe a little bit of air in there, but we can take care of that with regular bleeding. But that, I maybe spent 5 minutes until I got to that point. I found it easier to push this push rod all the way in and then start to fill that as I release the push rod, so it sucked everything in. And then, all right, I have it set up to reverse bleed. This is the little pump can that's filled. It's a brand new one that's filled with DOT4 brake fluid, and this line is set up to the bleed screw here. Here's the, let me see if I can turn this a little. Here's the wrench. I'll open it up. I'll press that lever to pump fluid into it, and then I'll close this up. And what it should do is pump fluid into this slave cylinder through this line, all right, and all the way up, and press and push any bubbles upwards that are in this line. Push them upwards through the master cylinder and up into the brake reservoir. What I got to do right now is go up to the brake reservoir and make sure there's room, that it's not topped off, and make sure there's room so that that brake reservoir doesn't overflow. And I have a small syringe that I'm going to use to withdraw fluid from that, just so I have extra room. This is my master brake cylinder reservoir. This is the line right here that leads to the clutch master cylinder. This does not have excess fluid in it, but if it did, I would use this syringe, which this is a syringe that I use for of an extra one for refilling my ink cartridges on my printer. I would put it in and I would draw the fluid out. I see there's fluid in there now, and then I would empty that fluid out in a separate pan on the side. I would just empty it out. But I don't have to do that because this is fairly empty. So anything I pump in from the bottom is not going to overflow this. So that's what I'm going to do right now. One thing before I start this, I'll open up the bleed screw and I'll start pumping from the little pump can right here. This is the oil can. Now when you pump, you don't have to close that bleed screw because you won't be sucking air or fluid back into this can, because this pump is meant to pull fluid from the can and not pull fluid back in when you take another stroke with this lever. So I can open this up and let's see if I can lay this down. Maybe I can get a picture of me doing it. I don't know. Let's see. All right, I'm going to put this down over here. Let's see. And I'm in the shadow here. So what I have to do is I'll open this up and I'm going to hold this hose on here with my hand so it doesn't leak out, and I'm going to start to pump. And I'm pumping fluid up into the brake reservoir. Some of it's escaping just a little because along through the threads of the bleed screw, that's what's dripping from that wrench. I don't know if you can see this. Just got to make sure that this is full enough that you're not going to start pumping air into it. You don't run dry. All right, I'm going to shut this now. I'll make sure that's shut. And let me make sure this is tight. Okay. And we're going to give this clutch a try, see what happens. What I'm going to do now is this is the line that comes in from the master clutch cylinder. Excuse me. I'm going to attach the slave cylinder up into those two studs and feed it in, and then I'm going to attach this line. I wanted you to see this. Make sure that when you put this slave cylinder up, that you put it in as, let's see if I can get the camera angle on that, that you put it in as straight as you possibly can and not at any angle, so that that push rod attaches, or rather comes in contact with the clutch throwout bearing finger. Let's see. I think we're hitting it right now, actually. Let me see. No, we may not be. I don't know. I think we are, because let me reach in there. It can't be that far. That's about as far as my finger. Let's see. I guess it is contacting it. So it's pushing fluid out of the opening for the supply opening for the brake fluid. So let's try it again. Not easy getting that up in there for some reason. All right, I'm going to have to shut this camera off to do this. I had to I pushed this master cylinder on as far as I could. Where are we? Right here. This slave cylinder rather, as far as I could, and was able to thread this. When I was doing it, I noticed fluid coming out of here, which meant that the push rod was contacting the arm inside the for the throwout bearing. The problem is, in order to get the one, let me get in here further. In order to get the one on top of this, when I have to use this socket, and this socket, the nut falls in too deeply in order for me to start threading it. If I try to thread it by hand, stick this up on top of this and start threading it by hand. And the way I did it was to use both nuts, this nut, and put them in so that the top nut would be right at the edge and would contact the threads of the stud on the top. But since I'm holding it on with the top nut, I had to stick in 2 pebbles underneath this nut here to take up the space so that the nut's right on top, and hopefully I'll be able to get it up top and start to thread it on. It should go on. Let's see. You're working blind here. Nope, that's not it. All right, let me shut this off so I can use the move the light with the other hand. I was able to get this up successfully. I tightened the bolts over here, this one, and the one on the top up here. I tightened this line over here, and it seems pretty tight. I'm going to go up and see. What they suggest is that you quickly pump the clutch pedal about 10 or 20 times, and then come down and use the bleed screw right over here. Let's see if we can get a video. Use the bleed screw, there it is, and start to bleed it. So I'm going to see what kind of pressure I have up top. Here we are. Today's Saturday, June 11th, 2016. I put this in, I bled it, and I pumped the pedal, and nothing happened. The pedal seemed a little tighter than normal, but it didn't allow me to shift with the engine running. I spoke to a very, very experienced BMW guy. He told me to remove this line and remove the slave cylinder. Let the line start to drip, and then it'll start to flow a little more, and that'll bleed the system from here up to the clutch cylinder, the clutch master cylinder. He said then remove these 2 bolts and take this off. Of course, this is disconnected already. And he said take the slave cylinder and push the push rod in the slave cylinder against the transmission several times until the push it against the transmission body, push the push rod against it, holding the slave cylinder until it gets very, very, very hard. He said then connect the line back up. I'm sorry, I think you let it bleed first, then connect the line. Then take the body of the slave cylinder and push the push rod against the transmission until it gets very, very hard. So you've bled that while this line is on. Then hook it up. He said it's not easy because you got to push the push rod against the finger of the throw-out bearing, and it's difficult to get the two nuts on. Once you do that, he said, go into the car and get down on your hands and knees and grab the pedal with your hand and pump it about 50 times. He said you'll feel the pedal harden up, and the clutch master cylinder will start bleeding itself. I guess it removes the air and lets the air come up to the top. He said then when you go to drive the car, the clutch will feel about halfway, like half of its power, about half the, for about a few miles. He said, and then it starts to pump up, and as you use the clutch pedal, it bleeds itself, and you get a full clutch. So we're going to give it a try. We're going to remove the line, let it bleed, and then put it back on again. Okay, I opened the line up, and it started to drip, and then it started a nice steady flow, and it was all fluid. And then when I felt enough had gone through and taken any bubbles out of this line, I then secured it and tightened it up. I made sure the bleed screw was already tight, and now I'm going to take this and push it against the transmission of the body of the transmission. Let me put it in there. And I already did this, so it might be fairly tight, but he said it would get so tight you couldn't do it anymore. Maybe I should do it this way, so then any air bubbles travel up. I don't know, let's see. It would have to be like this, I guess. That's real tight. I don't know if you can see that in there. I put that in there, and I did it this way so that the air, any air that's coming out of that's going to go up on that tube. That's pretty tight. Now he said it's not going to be easy to get this on because that push rod is so tight that I'm gonna have to loosen that just a tad so I can turn this. Let me see. I'm gonna have to turn it counterclockwise. I can't. This hose is getting in the way of this. Here when I put it up, so it won't go in well if I try to put it up that way. Let me turn that just a bit. Alright, I just loosened this and turned the hose clockwise to get it out of the way of this thing over here when I go to try to mount it up. Let's see what happens. Because I want to be able to give it a straight shot in, going in, so that I don't hit the side of the what do you call it, of the throw-out bearing. Now it's tough to get past this point because it's hitting the throw-out bearing, and as you can see, it won't go in past this point. I'm going to have to really push it hard so to get it all the way seated. So once I get it threaded a little, I will get back to you. I've managed to get this on up here, this bolt and the one underneath back here, and it was so difficult to get this on because the push rod was contacting the throwout bearing, and since this is pumped up, it took a lot of pressure to push that on and put this bolt on. And because of the position I'm in under the car like this, laying on the ground, and it's very difficult to get both hands on it and then get that amount of pressure on it. My arms aren't strong enough to push that hard on for this stud to come all the way through to start this nut. So I had to get a screwdriver and wedge the screwdriver in here and push against here, and then that didn't work because there's too much room here. So I had to get a vice grip and clamp this piece here with the vice grip, and then with this extra piece on top of my finger, with that extra piece, that room from here to here, I was able to get a screwdriver and wedge it in here and push against this piece here, and still have enough room to thread this nut once the stud went in. So it took a long time. It took me about almost 2 hours to do it. So we're going to see what happens. So he said to pump this up with your hand about 50 shots. That's the strongest I've ever felt it. Very strong, very strong. And we'll see what happens. I'm running low on battery, so I'm going to turn this off. Okay, it's about as difficult. It's very tough to push the pedal in. Very strong feeling to it, so I think this may be okay. Let's start it up and see what happens. Where's my key? Yep, I can shift it in and out of gear. That's it. Put the clutch in, boom, in gear. That's what I've been waiting for. It only took 2 months, unbelievable, maybe more, 3 months of off and on working on it. That's it. I'm going to take this to church. Okay.